Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. As always, I am your host, Sarah, and I am happy to be back with you for yet another episode, yet another author interview. Before we get to that author interview, I'm having a bit of a moment of, I can't believe it's the last day of January already. I don't know why this surprises me, but wasn't it just Christmas? And didn't we just have New Year's? And now we're a month into 2018, and I don't know. Maybe it's just a sign that I am aging because time seems to be going a lot faster than it used to. At any rate, it is the last day of January. Tomorrow begins a new month. I hope that this first month of the new year has been good to you, and I hope that February is just as good. If you are living in some place with winter, February is just a little bit closer to spring, so I'm hoping that you are getting a little bit nicer weather, although February can be just as strange as January in terms of crazy winter weather. At any rate, that's enough of my ramblings about the date and time and weather report. As I mentioned on the last episode, we have a slightly different interview today than I normally do, and that is a good thing. I'm excited about that. I don't normally do nonfiction, and that's not because I don't want to or I don't like it. It's just the opportunity has not yet presented itself. And recently, an author contacted us on a different podcast, the Women's MMA podcast, and said that he had written a book about women's MMA in Britain, the history of women's MMA in Britain, and was wondering if we would interview him for that podcast. And we said sure. And we, my co-host and I, Tate, who co-hosts Women's MMA with me, did that interview on Sunday. We Skyped with the author, whose name is Alistair Hendrie, in London, which is always fun to try to figure out those time differences. And we had a lot of fun, and we'd already told him that we would put it on the Women's MMA show as well as the Book Review Podcast, because this is, well, it's in the title. It's a book review podcast. We talk about books. So this might not be your cup of tea. Yes, that rhymed, and it was a little bit of a pun and a play on words because the guy is from UK, and so I mentioned tea. This book might not be for you, but that can be said about every book that we talk about on this show. So if you're not into women's MMA, this might not be the book for you. If you have never really thought about women's MMA, you might want to check it out and see what this is all about, because he talks about the history of not only the women who fight in the MMA in Britain, but also how the sport developed and how it has evolved over the last 20 or so years since its incarnation, and it's just a good overall view of the sport. So let me give you the blurb from the book, and this is from the Amazon page. So the book is called Fight Game, The Untold Story of Women's MMA in Britain. As I said, it's by Alistair Hendrie, and that description is as follows. When Rosie Sexton fought Alexis Davis in 2013, she made history and became the first British woman to compete in the UFC. Fight Game reveals how Britain's female fighters broke down barriers, offering interviews from stars such as Sexton and the UFC's Joanne Calderwood. With its intimate take on the growth of the scene, landmark moments, and the personalities within the sport, Fight Game is an inspiring tale of dedication, sacrifice, and ultimately acceptance. So again, that was the description of Fight Game, The Untold Story of Women's MMA in Britain, and it is by Alistair Hendrie. So again, it's nonfiction. It is about women's combat sports, which is very different from the books that I normally talk about. But as I said, I co-host the women's MMA podcast with Tate. I never really watched MMA. All I knew about MMA was when it first started, and they used to say, two men enter, only one will leave. And I was just like, no, that's not for me. And then my hubby got me to start watching it with him and got me to learn a little bit more about the tactics behind it. He used to do mixed martial arts when he was in college. And so I cannot say that I am the world's biggest fan of MMA, but I do like watching the women. I think that they are often the more interesting and exciting fighters in the sport. And so it was really interesting to read this book and then talk to Alistair about it. So that's probably enough out of me. Let's get to that interview. You will hear a different voice on this podcast because, as I said, Tate is also in the interview with me. So just so you know, that other voice you're hearing, that is Tate, who hosts our MMA podcast and who co-hosts Women's MMA. So let's get to that interview with Alistair Hendrie, author of Fight Game. Hi, Alistair. Welcome to the podcast. It's wonderful to speak to you.
Hi, thanks for having me.
This is my co-host, Tate.
How's it going there, my friend?
Yeah, very good, very good. You?
We're doing pretty good. We before we started this, we had a little some technical difficulties, as you know. So I'm just happy to be able to have you on.
Yes.
Yeah. I thought we weren't gonna make it at one point, but I got there in the end.
Yeah, we made it through the tough times. Now we're ready to roll.
Yeah.
Yep.
Cool, good stuff.
So we are here to actually talk about your book, Fight Game. Mm-hmm. But before we do that, I would love for our listeners just to get to know you a little bit. So if there's anything that you're comfortable sharing, we'd love to hear that.
Yeah, so I'm basically a freelance MMA reporter. I live in Reading in the UK, and I got into MMA probably about maybe about 6 or 7 years ago. So really not too long ago. I got into it after a friend of mine told me about the Ultimate Fighter series between Tito Ortiz and Ken Shamrock. And as I was saying before we were on air, at the time I thought. I was like, what, Ken Shamrock? The professional wrestling guy, the world's most dangerous man. I had no idea what MMA was, no idea about the UFC. So I was kind of aware of it. And then after my parents bought ESPN in our house, I kind of stumbled across the UFC again. I recorded a couple of fights and I was kind of putting off watching it for a while. I just kept forgetting to watch it. And in the end, the first fight that I watched I think it was the first fight between Chael Sonnen and Anderson Silva. And I was just hooked straight away. Just the finish was incredible. And I was saying before it felt like no one in the arena wanted Anderson Silva to win, there, if you told me that this guy was, the greatest MMA fighter of all time back then, I'd have said, well, you don't really seem to be that popular, but, it's just funny when you kind of come into the sport and know nothing about it. So I do a lot of writing in my spare time. I'm really not what you'd call a full-time journalist or anything like that. I've got a standard 9-to-5 day job, but I love MMA. I've got a big passion for MMA, and that's, of course, where the book came from, really.
Okay. Thank you for that. So go ahead and tell us about the Fight Game. Just give us a bit of an overview of the book.
So the book Fight Game: The Untold Story of Women's MMA in Britain, it was a funny one. It kind of came a little bit out of nowhere, really. So just to give a bit of background to the book, I've essentially covered a bit of a background and the development of the women's scene in the UK. So I've spoken to every female fighter of note pretty much in the UK, apart from one or two. So I've interviewed Rosie Sexton, Joanne Calderwood, Daniel West, going right back to the likes of Lisa Hygo, Kelly Salone as well. And I spoke to them all and covered how the scene got going, how they got fights, perceptions of the sport. And I've also tried to take it right up to the present day and interviewed the likes of Kate Jackson, Kerry Hughes, Joanne Calderwood as well. It's something I'm really, really proud of. And I think that the nice thing is that I think I've managed to profile both the private and professional lives of the fighters as well, because they're I mean, as you both know, they're such interesting characters. I mean, for example, I spoke to a lady called Wendy McKenna, who's I think she had a few amateur fights with Cage Warriors and has recently turned pro. And I mean, she's got an incredible background. She was in the army in Northern Ireland, and now her daughter, Corey McKenna, is now one of Britain's probably best amateurs, and she's looking at turning pro now with Cage Warriors. Apart from that, I also spoke to Danielle West, who's got an incredible story. You know, she grew up in America, ran away from home when she was a child, and she was kind of in and out of care homes, and then in the end, she kind of relocates to Britain and finds herself fighting Rin Nakai, who was one of the biggest names in the sport in Japan. So, there's a lot of really, really cool stories in there. I'm really pleased to have kind of brought it full circle. I spoke to a guy called Ian Dean, who's one of the real prominent figures in UK MMA, Cage Warriors matchmaker. And I spoke at great length with him about the women's divisions. So, and I also kind of tried to bring it to the present day as well and speak to the likes of Helen Harper and Brian E. Terrell, who are both coming through at the moment. And another thing, I also tried to, I also wrote a lot about the social perceptions and the connotations of the sport in the media. So, for example, I think a lot of media in this country don't really understand MMA or women's MMA, or that they're not as aware of it as they should be. So I've kind of tried to shed a bit of light on that. And yeah, it's something I'm really pleased of. So I'd love if people went out and gave it a read and gave me their thoughts. I'd be delighted to hear anyone's thoughts on it, to be honest.
Now, you know,
I do have to interrupt so we can take our first break of the podcast, but it has been a lot of fun talking with Alistair and having a co-host for this particular interview. I love talking to people with accents that are different than mine because I just love listening to how they form words and the different ways that they say things, the different phrases that they use. In fact, it was nice to have a co-host for this interview because when I'm listening to someone speak who has an accent, I get so caught up in listening and thinking about the way they say words and just hearing the different vocabulary, the way they pronounce things, that I get sidetracked. So it's really fun to listen to someone who sounds different than most people that I speak to on a daily basis. So, as I said, we do have to take that first break of the podcast, and when we come back, we'll have more with Alistair Hendrie. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and we will be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. We, and I can actually say we and not have it sound like I'm using the royal we for once because I do have a co-host. We, Tate and I, are speaking today with author Alistair Hendrie about his book Fight Game and the history of women's MMA in Britain. So let's get back to that interview.
I'm a big fan of women's MMA. That's one of the reasons why I was super excited about having you on. But even when you look at whole, even some of the other journalists out there, a lot of times, a lot of the top journalists will skip over the women's MMA genre pretty much, and primarily stick to men, which I've always thought is a big mistake because I always think the women always steal the show, especially on UFC events. And wouldn't it have been easier to do a book about, let's say, like Michael Bisping or Dan Harding or someone like that, instead of the women? I mean, I appreciate the fact that you did the book on women because I think they don't get enough, enough PR. So what was your thought into picking women over the bigger names?
Because it's something which just hasn't been done, I'm absolutely stunned that there's not more books about just women's combat sports in general. For example, I've kind of searched on Amazon and a couple of websites. I mean, if anyone knows any more, do let me know. But I think there's an American one called She's a Knockout, and there's really not that many other books about women's combat sports. I mean, I know, of course, Ronda Rousey and Nicola Adams and women like that have written biographies. But in terms of, a journalistic book from an educational perspective, there's really not that much. Plus, I think it'd be extremely difficult for me to get access to Michael Bisping. I mean, even though I've met him once or twice, he's so down to earth. He's exactly like he is on when he's in front of the cameras. But yeah, I think I'd rather do something which is a little bit untold, a little bit left field, and it's something I'm really, really pleased with. And I think the other thing about this is that we're at a time now where women's fighting is becoming a lot more accepted. If you look over history, even from the Stone Ages and the Dark Ages and World Wars, way back when it was always men fighting. But now in the modern era, we're seeing women in combat sports, and I think it's a really, really good thing, because I think, especially at a time when, because of stuff like Instagram and social media these days, it's like there seems to be a little bit of society where women have to kind of worry about being feminine or beautiful or whatever you might have, whereas I kind of wanted to say that MMA should be a sport for everyone, regardless of the gender, and that women can take up combat sports. And I think, as well as that, in Britain, we have shown that with Rosie Sexton, Joanne Calderwood. Even aside from that, we had Jade Jones, who I think won an Olympic gold medal in Taekwondo in London. And we also had, again, Nicola Adams, who's had phenomenal success. She's turned pro now, and BT Sport in the UK have got her fights. So yeah, I kind of just wanted to say, women's MMA is here, and it's a big thing, and I wanted to give a bit of background to it, and I hope I did that.
All right.
So what would you say to someone who would say that the women's fights are just not as good as the men's fight? You hear that all the time.
And I disagree with that, by the way.
I do too, but people say it all the time.
Yes,
they
no,
just
I agree
don't
with you,
think
yes.
the women's fights are as exciting or as powerful or as good. What would you say to them?
Well, it's an interesting one, because Kerry Hughes said to me, I think women's fights are more interesting because, with all due respect, if the level is a little bit lower, it's a bit more equal. And I think the thing is, women's MMA is still developing. If you look at, Nunes against Rousey, Tate against Zingano, Gina Serrano against Cyborg, those are three of really the most exciting MMA fights you'll ever see. Even Sexton and Ashlyn Daly, that was an incredible fight back in, I think it was about 2010 to 2011. There was barely any striking, but it was one of the best fights I've ever seen. So I think you're always going to get detractors. It's crazy right now. I mean, some of the biggest names in the sport have said that they're not a fan of women's MMA, but it's crazy really, because even though we're in 2017, there is still that kind of element of, not like sexism, but I think we still do live in quite a misogynistic society in some ways. And things like sexism and racism and all those kind of things, I think you're always going to have people who unfortunately do keep bringing these things to the table. So you've just got to give it a chance, really. I know MMA is obviously traditionally a male-dominated sport, but you've seen over the last few years, I mean, even forgetting the likes of Tate and Rousey, women like even people like Raquel Pennington, Juliana Pena, these fighters are really some of the best in the world. So, I mean, women can fight just as well as the men, and I think they should, they should definitely be seen as, equal in coverage and everything, really.
Right. Great. Yeah.
So what kind of research did you do for the book? I mean, obviously, I've read it, so I know you talked to several fighters, but talk about your process for the research.
Yeah, it was really, really, it kind of just snowballed really. So I did the interview with Rosie Sexton, and after that I interviewed Laura O'Brien Howarth, Lisa Hygo, a few others as well, and it just snowballed from there really. So I would literally spend hours and hours and hours just watching fights on YouTube, researching on Sherdog, messaging people on Facebook to speak to me. I think the really, really nice thing was that I think pretty much everyone who I messaged on Facebook actually kind of replied to me to speak to the book. So that was really, really cool. But yeah, I mean, it was an incredibly long process. There were many, many, many times where I thought this book isn't going to work out. I think I probably tried to interview Calderwood for about between like a year and 18 months unsuccessfully. Because I think this was actually before she was in the UFC. So literally, like, I contacted her gym, I contacted her Twitter, her Facebook, yeah, it was because I was just thinking, like, I really can't write the book without Britain's most well-known fighter. So yeah, I mean, in terms of the research, it was really, really nice because I got to find out so much about women like Danielle West and a woman called Kelly Salone. It was so funny because she actually owns a cycling brand now, which essentially makes kind of cycling wear for women. And I was Googling her name, and she was all I could find. And I digged a little bit deeper, and I thought, oh, it's the same person. So yeah, I think she had two fights. I think she had one amateur and one pro fight in around 2001, 2002. So I got to speak to her, and she was, yeah, really, really funny, really, really approachable. And I think that was one of the really, really awesome things because I got to expand my knowledge of MMA so greatly, and it never really felt like a chore. Although it was such a long, arduous process in places, and the amount of proofreading that I had to do on my own as well was quite sort of gargantuan at times, really. So yeah, I mean, if anyone out there was looking to write a book, it's a lot of work, but yeah, it's a very rewarding and enjoyable process in the long run.
I'm going to jump in here with our second and final break of the podcast, and when we come back, we will be concluding this interview with author Alistair Hendrie, so stay tuned. You are listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and we will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Here is the conclusion to our interview with author Alistair Hendrie.
Now, you mentioned Joanne Calderwood, and one of the big things, a lot of people in the States don't realize how popular she is in the UK. Especially when you listen to her and you listen to her voice, and she has that kind of that little, I don't want to say it sound rude, but it's a very soft voice, but then she's this beast in the ring. Talk about her popularity.
Well, yeah, I think the thing about Joanne is that when I was in Glasgow, she was probably the most popular fighter there, probably on the same level as Bisping. I actually retweeted a picture of the line to interview her, at the media day in Glasgow when she fought Courtney Casey, and it literally like snaked all over the room. And I think the thing about a lot of personalities in British MMA, you get the brash guys like Bisping and Paul Daly, those kind of guys. But then you also get, Rosie Sexton and Joan Calderwood, who are both just so sort of down to earth. You'd never think in a million years after speaking to either of them, if you knew nothing about MMA, you wouldn't think they were fighters at all. They just completely buck stereotypes. And I think the thing about Joanne is that I think you could definitely see it in her Invicta fights. I mean, she's such an exciting fighter to watch. She's got everything. She's got knees up the middle, the teep kicks. And I think Joanne Calderwood is a really, really good example of where British women's MMA is at. I mean, we're kind of, our very best fighter could kind of get like top 10 in the UFC. But after that, it's a bit of a glass ceiling, I think, unfortunately. And I think Calderwood's got to the point where she can't, smash people with her Muay Thai skills like she could in Invicta and Cage Warriors. Don't get me wrong, she's an outstanding fighter, but she had a very close fight with Calvillo a couple of months ago, and right. You just think, if that was before the UFC, maybe she would have won that, landslide on points, but. Having said that, she's lost real world-class girls. I mean, Jessica Andrade is an absolute beast, even though she's one of those fighters who just manages to look incredibly small, whatever weight class she competes in. But I mean, if you saw her fight against Courtney Casey, she really ran through her and really snatched the decision in the end. That third round was, she almost kind of took the decision out of the judges' hands there. But I think she's just incredibly humble, and I think she's got a really cool backstory. It's quite funny because Bryony Terrell, who I profiled in the book, works as a nurse. Kerry Hughes, who I profiled in the book, works in the police, and Joanne Calderwood also used to work in nursing as well. So I think it's really, really cool how a lot of these women come from very kind of respectable jobs. So it just shows that it is a sport for all walks of life. And I think, Joanne Calderwood, she's got that kind of like human element as well, because she has, had like everyday jobs and that kind of thing. And she's gone out to TriStar to really make it work. And I think she probably needs a good win or two now behind under her belt now. But she's definitely one of the most popular fighters in Britain.
Now, you mentioned the fact that, the British fighters, they can get almost, it's kind of like a little bubble there where they can get to the top 10. They can get almost to the top 10, but they just can't get over the hump. But then you look at some of like the Polish fighters who are just breaking in everywhere. Why is there such a difference? In your opinion, that's your opinion.
It's, do you know what? It's so difficult. I'd really, really love to be able to tell you, but I think generally, apart from Bisping, really in the last kind of 5 years, we've just struggled to have anyone who can kind of get over the line. So, for example, you had Dan Hardy who had the fight with GSP, but he obviously went a bit off the ball and had those 3 losses towards the end of his career. I know Brad Pickett and Ross Pearson have been very much kind of win-loss. Brad's obviously retired now, but I know he was kind of struggling for a bit of consistency. But of course, that's no kind of disrespect to any of those guys, because they were legends of British MMA. But yeah, I mean, in terms of Polish MMA, I think it's really, really blowing up out there. I'd love to be able to tell you, why there's been such an explosion of Polish MMA at the moment. And I think because a lot of them are actually training in America, so maybe that's the way to go. I know Jan Blachowicz is doing good things at the moment. They've obviously got Jędrzejczyk and Omielanczuk. And I mean, KSW are doing incredible things as well. And I know M1, I think they have a lot of shows in Poland. So yeah, I'd love to be able to say why a country like Poland is producing these stars, but it's a little bit like when someone like Ngannou steps up to Miocic. So, for example, Ngannou was knocking everyone out, absolutely everyone.
Yes.
Then when he comes up against someone who knew has incredible wrestling, like Miocic, you know, he gets found out. And I think that's the thing. MMA is still a young sport. There are levels to it. And I think Britain 100% were at a disadvantage in terms of ground game and grappling and wrestling because it's so ingrained in American culture. But at the same time, you know, we've got a lot of young guys coming up. Arnold Allen is absolutely incredible. And Nathaniel Wood in Cage Warriors is doing great things as well. So yeah, I couldn't tell you why Polish fighters are kind of on the rise at the moment, but yeah, I think it just depends on the kind of training that you can get, and I think for British fighters you kind of need to go out to America. So I know a lot of our guys have gone out to American Top Team and those kind of places. So yeah, I think it's just a case of doing that and then taking it to the next level, really.
All right.
So you mentioned in the book a little bit about how women's sports don't seem to be covered as well as men's sports in the UK, how there just is kind of this disconnect. Do you see that at all as part of why women or even MMA fighters in general don't get the rankings or, you know, don't?
Because pretty much because of their popularity, they don't get the bigger fights. They don't get the notoriety.
Do you see any connection between those?
I think in terms of rankings and that kind of thing, I'm not too sure if there's any correlation in terms of that. But yeah, in terms of whether or not the media could push British fighters more, I think 100% they could. I think, and it's a bit sad really, because if you look at people like Kate Jackson, who's a very humble, respectful fighter, you know, she's one where it kind of pains me to say it, but you know, if she kind of trash talked a bit more and had a bit of a bigger profile, then maybe she would have been in the UFC by now. I mean, she's doing great things. She just fought Valerie Letourneau in Bellator, but yeah, I think the media could be doing a lot more. I think in terms of coverage, the BBC, I just don't really think their coverage is there right now. I think it's the same in terms of the Times as well, the Guardian as well. I think the Guardian, they seem to kind of ignore MMA and unless it's something about Michael Bisping. I mean, having said that, the BBC have just got a podcast come out with Dan Hardy and a few other British journalists, which is really, really good. So yeah, it's heading in the right direction, but I definitely think the media could be doing more. But yeah, I think in terms of women's sports in general, this country, the coverage is actually really good. BT Sport, who are one of the main broadcasters here, do plenty to sort of big up women's sport in Britain. And one of our tennis players, Joanna Konta, just got to the semi-finals of Wimbledon, and yeah, she's blowing up as well. So obviously we know all about the likes of Nicola Adams as well, and I think historically we've had the likes of Jessica Ennis-Hill in athletics. So yeah, I think generally the coverage of women's sport in Britain is it's okay. It's definitely getting there, but I think we need to do more to show the likes of the BBC and the Times that, you know, there's more to MMA than Conor McGregor. So yeah.
Sure.
And you know, you can't talk MMA anymore without mentioning Conor McGregor.
Oh no, you can't. You really can't.
I want to once again thank first my co-host Tate for joining me for this interview. It was fun to do something a little bit different with him than I normally do for our shows. And I also want to thank our guest, author Alistair Hendrie, for talking about his book, Fight Game, The Untold Story of Women's MMA in Britain. If it feels like that interview ended a little bit abruptly, you would be correct. We had the most crazy Skype problems. I mean, any Skype problem you can imagine, we had it. And we finally had to mutually agree that we would stop the interview where it was, and hopefully he will be back on the show, the women's MMA show, to talk about some of the upcoming fights that some of the British women are fighting in, not necessarily on the book review podcast, unless of course he writes another book. He did want us to mention that there is an excerpt of his book on his website, and I'm going to include that information in the show description as well as on the blog post that always accompanies these episodes. So look for the website, Alistair's website, on not only the show description here, but also on the blog post. And that blog, just as a reminder, is www.gsmcbookreview.blogspot.com. Let me say that one more time and try not to stutter. One of these days, I will be able to say it without stuttering. www.gsmcbookreview.blogspot.com. And there you will find the link to Alistair's website that has an excerpt from his book that includes part of one of his interviews with Rosie Sexton, who was one of the pioneers of Britain's MMA in terms of women fighters. So you'll want to check that out. Also, he wanted us to let you know that his book is available on Kindle. You can go to Amazon and his book is available on Kindle, but you do not have to have a Kindle to read the book. It's available on all platforms. So on Amazon through Kindle, but regardless of what kind of an e-reader you have, you can get that book. So he wanted us to make sure that we mentioned that since he wasn't able to because of silly Skype. So thank you so much for Alistair's patience and for him joining us and talking about his book. I hope you will join me again next time when I will be speaking with, I don't know how to pronounce her name, Leah de Cesarar? Oh, I should ask her how to pronounce that. I just butchered your name, Leah. I am so sorry. And next week when I talk to you, you can yell at me for butchering that and not checking first. At any rate, she's written a book called Forks, Knives, and Spoons, and we will be talking about that. And I'm very excited to chat with her. She seems like a lot of fun in the brief emails that we've exchanged. So looking forward to that. And I hope you will join me for that podcast. In the meantime, you can find all of our podcasts at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Even that women's MMA podcast, you might want to check something different out. I don't know. You can read and watch women's MMA. I mean, heck, I do. You can download all of our podcasts on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, any app that you use for your mobile device. And you can follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Facebook, as well as checking out our blogs that accompany our blog posts that accompany each episode. Thank you for being my wonderful listeners and for being, I know you're wonderful readers because you listen to a podcast about books. So you're just wonderful in general. I hope you'll join me again next time when I will hopefully pronounce my author's name correctly. But in the meantime, get out there and get yourself lost in a good book. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.